Welcome to the Art Coaching Club podcast. I'm your host, Hayley Price, artist, owner of the online art gallery, The Scouted Studio, and business coach for artists. With experience starting and running my own art business, growing an online art gallery, and coaching artists internationally on how to grow their careers, I've learned the art world inside and out. I've made all of the mistakes so you don't have to. Every episode will be a little bit different, but I promise that each week I will show you how to tackle your biggest business challenges so you can get back in the studio doing what you love. Now let's get into it. Good morning. We are back with another solo episode, and this one's also going live on YouTube, which I'm really excited about. If you are watching it on YouTube, you'll see Hudson is sitting at my feet. I am wearing an all denim outfit, something I never really thought I would wear, but it's cozy and that's the vibes today. So today we are going to talk about something that has come up so many times in the club. I thought it needed its own dedicated podcast and Substack, and that is all things photography. So today, specifically in this podcast, we're going to talk about hiring a photographer, why photography matters, how often you should work with a photographer, all of that good stuff. And then in the Substack, you can continue reading about this. And if you are a paid subscriber for $12 a month, you can also get the bonus content on all of my tips for actually having a photo shoot. So everything from how to find the best photographer, to how to make sure the photos are aligned for your branding, to what to wear, to, some of it sounds so minuscule, but as someone who has done just a handful of photo shoots and everyone has turned out well, I'm going to set you up so you really only have to invest maybe once a year and you can have photos that last you for a very, very, very long time, because I know it's expensive. So the point of today's call is to tell you why you need to invest in a photographer, or at least good photography if you're DIYing it. And then in that Substack, if you are a subscriber, you will see an accompanying message and tips on how to actually go about having your photo shoot. So whether you're a seasoned photo shoot artist or you're not, this should be really, really helpful. So let's get into a little bit of an introduction. So first, why does photography matter? So I'm going to talk a little bit about different times I've used photographers and just two different examples. One, when I first launched the rebrand of the Scouted Studio, I hired a photographer because I needed imagery to fill the website that represented my new brand. Similarly, I hired a photographer when I relaunched the branding of the Art Coaching Club, when I went from the Patreon to this new venture, which is the club. Totally different. I needed all new branding, which really meant I needed all new photos. And I think if you scroll back on my Instagram and you see that shift in branding, it was the pinks, and now it's a little bit more greens and muted colors. I carried that over in my photography as well. So I do think photography matters from a branding standpoint. And if you're making any type of shift, you really need photography to show that. But also, I do think there's a level of professionalism that comes from having great photos. And a lot of it can be done yourself. I take tons of photos myself. I do it on my iPhone. I have a great camera. And so it's totally doable on your own, but I also think every once in a while bringing in a professional that can capture you and capture your essence is so important. And I know that sounds a little woo-woo, but I do think if you go back and you look through even the photos on the homepage of the artcoachingclub.com or the Scouted Studio website, even the photos of the artwork, they capture the spirit that is the Scouted Studio. And if you go to the Art Coaching Club, the photos on there really capture who I am as a person. And I don't think I could necessarily do that myself. That's why you bring in the professional. So obviously photography matters, and it's really transformed my business because it's brought clarity to my branding, and it's given me a level of professionalism that if you are going to charge people a certain amount, which we should have a whole other call on money, but you do need to present yourself as a professional. I also want to touch on the power of visuals. So professional photos immediately grab attention and they leave a lasting impression, especially in this age of social media, short attention spans. You want to be the artist that stands out. You don't want crappy photos. A lot of times you get one chance to impress people. I mean, I don't want to say that, but it is that first impression is important when people come to your feed, when people come to your website, however people find you, that initial reaction and that initial, thought they have is really important. And so what I want to talk about today is what your takeaways will be. We're going to talk about why photography matters. We're going to talk about the power of visuals. We're going to talk about if you're ready to hire a photographer or if you should consider DIY options. I think most of you probably are at a point where you should hire a photographer. I think most people can find a way to do it really affordably. And then we'll get into just like general benefits and takeaways. So let's start off with the benefits of hiring a professional photographer. One, I already touched on this, brand elevation. High quality visuals set your brand apart from competitors, truly. I have had so many artists I've worked with who have a very small following. They maybe haven't sold a ton of artwork yet, but if they have great photos of their work, great lighting, it captures the viewer, it captures the story they're trying to tell. Their brand is immediately elevated, and I want to work with them as a gallery owner. Also, I mentioned you only have a short amount of time to capture people's attention. That's really important. And so having great photos really does elevate your brand. I've said this before. You can have a really well-designed, incredible website, or you could even have a whole social media team. But if you don't have great photos to fill that website platform or to work with your social media team, the website's going to look terrible. Your social media is not going to look great. And vice versa, you can have a pretty crappy template. You can go look at, I don't want to say I have a bad template, but like you can look at the Art Coaching Club websites. It's not some crazy template. It's just good photos. And so high quality visuals can be the difference between looking professional and not. I also think it gives you this level of consistency across platforms. So if you have images that you're consistently using the same photographer or the same, similar photographers with similar editing styles, maybe you stick to a certain palette or you're always in your studio or there's, even just using one photographer, they're going to have the way they shoot you and they tell your story visually. That's going to create consistency across platforms. Also, those polished images are going to probably be used on your website, your social media, and your promotional materials. Like that little circle on Instagram should also be, your photo on your about page should also be in your newsletter, let's say. Like all of a sudden that creates brand consistency. Next, really the photographer's job is to tell your story through imagery, but you also have the ability to build on that. So when you work with a photographer, you want to explain to them what your brand is and what you're trying to say. My dog is tearing up my rug. Hudson, don't do that. I know you're bored, but we're not going to do that. Okay, I'm back. Sorry. Hudson was eating my rug. He really has been wanting attention lately, which we love, but we just went on a walk. He should be okay. So circling back to talking about storytelling through imagery, the professional photos, the photographer should be telling the beginning of your story, but you should also help to tell your story. So when you think about your brand identity, so who you are, where the artwork is, and who your ideal customer is, where those three things intersect should be your brand identity. That's the story you need to tell through your work. So I always like to say, think about 3 adjectives that describe you, your ideal customer, your work, ultimately your brand. What are the 3 adjectives you want to evoke? Let's say you're a really friendly brand. That's going to be very different photos. And then if you're a really sophisticated, kind of mysterious brand, I see those being a little bit more, black and white, moody. You might not be smiling at the camera as much. Versus if you're a friendly, really colorful brand, that's going to look totally different. I could see you like in overalls, painting in your studio, laughing, like totally different types of brands. So your story should really come through with the imagery itself. And I think if you have a really good photographer, they're going to ask you a lot of these questions up front, especially if you work with a brand photographer, which I have done before. She asked me to truly fill out a whole worksheet on like adjectives to describe your brand. What do you want the photos to evoke? And she really kind of helped me figure out what those things were. And so now I'm sharing it with you. Another benefit of hiring a professional photographer is the long-term value. You can invest in a shoot really just once a year, and it can provide images you can repurpose for months, truly. And if not that, they can stay even longer on your website. I mean, social media, it really depends on how often you're using them, how you're tweaking them, all that stuff. But the long-term value of photos that can go on your website really, I haven't updated my Scouted Studio homepage, like the banner. Obviously, I update parts of it with new artwork, but those professional photos have lasted for forever. The Art Coaching Club, I don't expect to change a lot of those photos very often because I also really brought in that branding, that rebrand, even into the colors that I was wearing in those photos. So they work super, super well. And then finally, there is a confidence boost that comes with having professional photos. You have this internal feeling of, okay, I'm legit, to be quite honest, because I think so many of us faced imposter syndrome. And truly great photos can make you feel more confident about how beautiful your work is, how amazing you are as a person, how stunning you are. And it can make you feel really confident. And so I think that's really important when it comes to building a business, because truly like 90% of the entrepreneurs, artists, women I talk to do face some level of imposter syndrome. And I think photos can really help to combat that. Also, I want to say, I have had a couple of people reach out and they're like, I feel a little self-centered, or I just feel strange taking photos of myself. One, that is something you will get over. But two, you have to separate yourself from the business, and you have to realize that you are a part of your business. In fact, I was speaking about this in the club. You're a third of your brand. So I think your brand is, like I said, partially your ideal customer, partially your art, and partially you, with each third making up the brand identity as a whole. And with that in mind, you're a third of your brand, which means it's okay for you to be in photos. In fact, you should be. And if that's uncomfortable to you, or you don't want to be the face of your brand, there's ways you can have a touch without it just being photos of you all the time. But people do want to see and want to know the person behind the brand. So don't ever feel like taking photos of yourself is self-centered. It's completely something I've had to get over. It's actually really funny. My original Instagram, like my personal account, which I don't ever use anymore, I've like never posted. Like I think my last post was, I didn't post my wedding on there. I think it was the day I got engaged. And the post before that was like the first photo with my boyfriend, like years apart. And so I was definitely someone that didn't take, or my now husband when he was my boyfriend, but I was someone who didn't take a lot of photos. And you do have to get over it. But for some reason, for me, it's so much easier to hire a photographer and in my mind say, this is for my business, than it is to go out and take a bunch of photos just for myself. And so I think if you can have that mindset, that will help. Then once you get the photos back, you're going to be like, I am so incredible. And you get that confidence boost. Okay. So I think we covered the benefits of hiring a photographer. Now let's get into timeline. I personally think you should have photos at least once a year. I generally think every 6 months is great. I will say right now I'm on the track for once a year, maybe twice a year. But I also have the benefit of, I just had a wedding, so I have a couple photos I can use from there. They're not like a perfect fit, but like photos of Charleston and things like that that fit my brand. I also have photos from founders retreats that I can kind of shuffle in. Again, not of my artwork, but kind of my brand. But in terms of artwork, of photos, and of me, I'm really on the once a year track. So I think we're going to start with once a year because I think that feels doable for a lot of you. You can set aside the money to do something once a year. So first, why do I think you need to do that? To stay current. So your personal style, your brand, your work should be evolving. I think people are like, oh my gosh, I want to paint one style. I got to have my style and I want to paint it forever. Even if you feel like you have your style, it's still going to evolve. You want to improve. You don't want to be stagnant. And so as you evolve, as your business evolves, your photos should reflect that. Also, I mean, I know I got a haircut. My hair's a lot shorter than it used to be, and I'm still using photos back when my hair was so long. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. But you also don't want to be using photos that are outdated or clothes you wouldn't wear anymore. Or like I used to use my photos from when I very first launched the Scouted Studio. I posted some of them quite recently, and that was 5-6 years ago I had that photo shoot. And finally one of my friends texted me and she was like, Hayley, I've seen this photo so many times. You don't look like this anymore. No offense. You're a lot younger and you wouldn't even wear that outfit anymore, potentially. So obviously there's the staying current piece. 2, just relevance. Having updated photos does make you appear, active and engaged with your audience. I think also if you want to do photo shoots more, it's beneficial for seasonal or kind of thematic content. So if you have kind of a bank of fresh images, it could be nice for new campaigns, new launches of artwork, but also clothing. Like you might not want to be wearing short sleeves when it's January and you're wearing like a full summer dress or something like that. So sometimes you do want to take that into account. And then it can highlight your growth. I mean, I think every time you can afford to do another photo shoot, that's a milestone. That's fantastic. But I also think getting a photo shoot every time you hit a milestone or are launching a new collection or have evolved your style, that's a way to symbolize your growth in your business over time, both for yourself, but also to show it to others. And then one more thing I want to touch on today is what to look for when hiring a photographer. And like I said earlier, I will get into more specifics into like how find a photographer and preparing for photo shoots more in the Substack for paid subscribers. But here are a couple of quick things you should look for if you're like, Hayley, I'm sold. I want to hire a photographer today. 1, portfolio and style match. You want to figure out the types of photos you want. Maybe look at your artwork and, like I said, figure out your brand adjectives to kind of figure out, do you want a photographer that's a little bit more moody, a little more bright and airy, like even down to their editing style? You want to make sure their style is aligned with your vision and specifically their editing style. I think that's something you can easily see on their Instagram grid. They're going to be posting their own photos or on their website. And I would say when you are prepared to reach out to that photographer, let's say you find a couple and you want to get, quotes, screenshot the photos you really like and be like, this is the style I really like. Can you replicate that for me? Because you don't want to work with a photographer and maybe they're, a friend or something like that, which we'll get to that later, but you don't want to work with them if you're telling them to completely change the way they're editing photos, because how would you like it if someone hired you to do a commission and then you're like, but I don't like your color palette. Can you do a totally different palette? Like, that is their craft. So, I will say if it's a friend and they're doing you a favor, maybe you have a little bit more wiggle room, but I do recommend as much as possible to try to use a photographer that has a style you already like. I also recommend, good communication is critical. So like I said, be as upfront as possible with the story you want to tell. Make sure they understand your brand goals, your preferences, all that stuff. Specialization does matter. You do kind of want to look for someone that specializes in branding or headshots or product photography, like depending on what you need. It's not always you can find someone who's specifically great at taking photos of artwork. But I do recommend when you reach out to the photographer to say, are you comfortable photographing artwork? Because you don't want someone who, tends to kind of overexpose products and focus on the person, because you don't want your artwork to be blown out looking, because that's the photographer style. And for those of you that are photographers, I'm probably not using the right terminology, but you do want to make sure you're working with someone who specifically specializes in enough of the area that they're willing to work with you. And a lot of the times that can just happen from a phone call or an email exchange to make sure they're prepared to work with you. They don't have to be, art photographers. That's great if they are, but if they're not, sometimes you can work with them. And then obviously you want to make sure their pricing is they have a good price point, what their package is. I generally look for people that kind of work by the hour so that you have a little bit of flexibility in the time versus, and I think that's pretty common, but it's worth spending money to find the right person. But I also want to make sure, and we'll talk about this more in the Substack, like generally what pricing should be, what to expect, and how to kind of ask those questions. So that is some of my tips. And then if you're like, Hayley, I just am not sure if I'm ready to hire a photographer, I do want to talk about a couple DIY photo tips before we close out today. So if you are just starting out, if you have a budget, basic tools you can use, the iPhone is great. I also think if you do have a camera, like I know I used to use my mom's DSLR because she didn't use it anymore. It was like she had it when we were kids and she wanted to capture us like playing sports or whatever. Those things don't really get run down. So I have used that, but honestly, I find the iPhone so easy to use. You just need to figure out the settings that work for you. I usually take the photos on my iPhone and then pull them into Lightroom just on my phone and kind of edit them that way. I also recommend natural lighting is always best. I take my paintings outside all the time, but ring lights can also be helpful. It's crazy. I pull mine out and Jack is like, are you an influencer? And I'm like, maybe. Ring lights can be great for great photography. And just finding like little nooks and crannies. Like I have found the couple of spaces in my house that have great lighting that I can style and I use them again and again and again. And it's as easy as that. So generally I recommend Lightroom as an app. And then I also pull things into Canva a lot. Not as much to edit, but to like get a white background or, to kind of, they have that great background remover if you pay for Canva. So that's a good tip. Also, another good tip is to borrow friends' houses, whether you're using a photographer or you're DIYing it. When you always are taking photos in your same house, in your house, sometimes it's nice to work with someone else who has the home that you'd want your work to be in, because that can fit your brand, but it's also just nice for different photos. So ask your friends if you can borrow their home. Also ask your friends for help. Ask a spouse, ask a friend to take photos of you, because like I said earlier, you do probably want to be in the photo. And then I just want to round out, you do want to build a long-term relationship with your photographer. So if you aren't DIYing it and you're doing it yourself, consistency is key. And if you can find one person, stick with them. They're going to love it. You're going to love it. How fantastic is that? You're also going to have a level of trust and comfort with them. It is uncomfortable sometimes getting in front of a new person and trying to act like yourself and having them take photos of you. So if you work with someone over and over, those repeated sessions, there's going to be an added level of trust, comfort, and they're going to know how to tell your story because they've done it before. And then also, you know, there might be an added value of maybe there's some perks or a discount because you have agreed to work with them for a specific amount of time. Again, all things you can talk about. But overall, I just want to kind of recap the key points today, that at some point, I really think everyone should have professional photography. It has truly skyrocketed my business. I know that sounds crazy, but it has. So I think investing in learning how to take photos yourself, even if you are going to hire a photographer, is key. You just, with how often we need to be posting on social media and just updating websites and stuff, we're really not in a position, or it doesn't make sense financially, to always hire a photographer to take all of our photos. Like, I do think you need some level of skill yourself. I also think you need to invest in a photographer potentially once a year if you can make that work. And then other key points we discussed, you know, how to find if a photographer is a good match, why yearly photos are essential, and all that other good stuff. So I encourage you to book a photographer, go through the photos, decide if you need to take new photos, or reach out if you want more information. I really recommend subscribing to the Substack because I include a lot more great advice in there. And then I will be back next week with another interesting, I think I have a great interview coming out. I need to remember when it's coming out, but great interviews coming up. And if you liked this podcast, please consider leaving a rating and review, because it helps me to get great guests and it just gives me more confidence to create great content like this. As a reminder, this will also be on YouTube, so if you enjoyed this post, feel free to watch it there or listen here anytime, and I will be back next Tuesday. Talk to you then.